This is my property at 1720 Lincolnshire Boulevard in Mississauga. And as you can see, it's in the process of being rewilded, so to speak. I'm mowing pathways through plots of natural vegetation. And the large vegetation, the tall vegetation that you see here, currently these are seed heads of Canada goldenrod. And Canada goldenrod is often mistaken for ragweed. And people sometimes look at this yard and, for example, say, well, I'm allergic and, you know, these plants are causing me allergies. But that's a totally misrepresented complaint, because Canada goldenrod is not, in fact, an allergen. Tufts of grass, this is mostly red fescue, and the tall stems of it provide essentially for young birds, for example, what's called a soft landing area. Because when birds nest in trees, often the young chicks, they depart the nest rather abruptly and fall to the ground, and leaves of the red fescue in this case provide a soft landing area for birds. So that's another advantage of letting the grass grow. Here is a group of plants which actually I seeded from utilizing seeds that I collected in one of Mississauga's parks. And these are called woodland sunflowers. And you can see the seed heads. I'm going to be collecting some more of these seeds and trying to distribute them throughout. They're a beautiful tall plant, and of course, as a sunflower, they are also a pollinating plant. The garden is growing naturally. There's very little effort put in on my part in terms of controlling what nature is doing here, other than when I do find here and there what are called noxious plants that are on the noxious weeds list, such as dog strangling vine, for example. I do remove them and dispose of them, as is required under the Ontario Weed Control Act. But all the other plants are essentially not noxious or not in need necessarily of being cut because they pose some kind of a threat or harm, potential harm, to either neighbors or the community at large. Also, this area here does in no way interfere with what's called sight lines, where traffic may be impeded by tall grass or bushes or weeds. Now, one of the other interesting plants which have thrived here and again, without any input on my part, are these substantial leaved plants here called moorgrass, in this case purple moorgrass. And the purple moorgrass is an ornamental grass. Some people actually pay money in order to plant purple moorgrass. It's a beautiful plant. During seed times, when these seed heads grow, for example, they're a beautiful tawny light brown color, and when there's a group of them together to watch them, for example, sway in the wind in the evening sunset, it's really a feast for the eye. It's beautiful. When the bylaw officers came with their crew in the last couple of years, they basically cut all of the ornamental purple moorgrass plants. So it was basically a form of destruction of a plant that people normally pay money for, and that doesn't pose any particular harm, other than the fact that the leaves, apparently, if they're over 20 centimeters, are contravening the bylaw, which is inexplicable to me. It's illogical somehow. There are a couple of other plants here, although they have passed their peak. These are again gone to seed but these are called sow thistles, sow thistle, and they have a very similar head, which is very similar to a dandelion head, and they provide nectar and food for insects as well. The thing about them is they can grow pretty tall, about 3 or 4 feet, and they happen to be on the quote-unquote nuisance weed list for the City of Mississauga. And so what they have done essentially when they came and cut the grass, the city crew, they essentially cut all the sow thistles as well, and thus basically robbed the insects and the other wildlife of the nectar and food that they normally would provide. The interesting thing is the sow thistle is totally edible. It's a medicinal plant, and it provides again, food and sustenance for insects and wildlife. And when I explained that, for example, to the city bylaw officers regarding, why is this plant being cut, they basically said, well, because it's a nuisance weed. Now, if something is medicinal and providing food for pollinators, how is it a nuisance? It's not noxious, it's not harming anybody. The interesting thing about the Ontario Weed Control Act is that as long as these kind of plants are more than 1 kilometer away from an agricultural operation or a horticultural operation, they are exempt from having to be removed. So it's ironic that in the City of Mississauga, in this suburb, in this community here, we are definitely more than 1 kilometer away from any agricultural or horticultural operation. So these sow thistles or any of these other plants that are over 20 centimeters high, etc., they pose no threat to the economy or to agricultural operations or profits or whatever. So these are the kind of issues that are, how shall I say, inexplicable somehow and illogical, and they don't make sense. Especially, again, since we are faced currently with this biodiversity crisis and ecological and environmental decline and ecocide, quite frankly. So, now take a look at that beautiful maple tree. It's really changed colors very, very rapidly in the last 2 or 3 days. Just gorgeous. If you look at this natural growth here, you can actually see where small mammals, for example rabbits, have created pathways through here, and basically it means that life form, the small mammals, be it chipmunks, squirrels, rabbits, there could be some voles here and there, maybe some mice, etc., that use these pathways in order to find their shelter or find their food. And the idea of quote-unquote these natural areas being a focus or a source of proliferation of rats, for example. This is an argument that's often made. This is, I think, an exaggeration because in a natural ecosystem, these small mammals are actually being controlled by the higher forms of life, such as foxes, coyotes, raptors, owls, hawks, etc. So the idea of a property like this going wild, becoming a focus for infestation of pests, so-called pests or other life forms in the community, is a total over-the-top exaggeration. Nature basically always tends to balance itself out, and it is not a critical do-or-die situation for the community at large to have the natural web of life basically maintaining a natural balance. In addition to the interest that I personally have in terms of supporting nature and natural processes. For me, what's very important is that what I see here when I'm sitting where the camera is here right now, what I see here is something that to me is alive and vibrant and changes every day, and depending on the light, depending on the wind, depending on the presence of animals, birds, insects, etc., it essentially affords for me a source of daily enjoyment and pleasure in terms of satisfying, I guess, my personal aesthetic sensibilities. And this is what this represents for me. It's enjoyment. I use it to photograph plants, insects, animals, etc. And for me, it's part of the quote-unquote operation of my property here to let parts of it grow wild and enable me to essentially on a daily basis enjoy just the visual stimulation and the reinforcement of a living environment. And when the enforcement action on the part of the city destroys this view that I have here, it essentially is contravening my charter rights, not only in terms of expression, but also in terms of my aesthetic sensibilities, which I thrive upon. Now, it's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea. Some neighbors may have other ideas of sensibilities, but I'm not forcing them to necessarily adopt my particular vision or sensibility towards nature and what stimulates me visually. But by the same token, the way the bylaw enforcement action is triggered is through a neighbor complaint, which 99.9% of the time is based on aesthetic sensibility of the neighbor versus my personal aesthetic sensibility. And as we all know from previous court cases in 1996, Bell versus the City of Toronto, aesthetic sensibilities essentially are subjective and cannot be utilized as a reason to enforce this bylaw. So the charter, if it's valid and if it's looked upon as a positive part of living, in a free and democratic nation such as Canada, then that particular charter needs to be respected in all regards. And when the city contravenes your charter rights by cutting something based on a neighbor complaint, which is based on an aesthetic value, that's a direct contravention of my charter rights. And it's unacceptable. This is a Carolina wren. Back in the 70s, when I was really into birding, I don't recall ever seeing a Carolina wren. They're quite a bit larger than our normal house wrens, which are tiny, tiny birds. But the Carolina wren has also an amazingly beautiful call. To sit out here, very relaxing and enjoyable, I don't have to drive to a park in order to bird watch. I can do it right here. I don't have to drive to a park to see flowers and plants and things growing naturally, because all of these plants that you see here and trees and bushes are what you see in parks. And the irony is that the City of Mississauga has in their bylaw a statement saying that council deems tall grass and weeds to be a public nuisance. And the reason I find it ironic is this is a private property. It's not a public property. So how can tall grass and weeds on my private property be a public nuisance when in a public park, in a public Mississauga park, these same tall grass and weeds are not considered to be a public nuisance and cut like they do on my property. This is a total example of hypocrisy and double standards. This is Etobicoke Creek that is flowing down there. That's sort of the borderline between Mississauga and Etobicoke. And I don't know if people are bothered by bylaw officers on the Etobicoke and Toronto side. Actually, that's an interesting point, because the initial case that established a lot of the parameters that we're dealing with as people who want to naturalize their properties is the 1996 case of Sandy Bell versus the City of Toronto. And the upshot of that entire case was that the City of Toronto modified their bylaws in order to take into account things like personal expression and so on and so forth. And one of the things that they modified, for example, is, and this is missing in a lot of the other bylaws in other municipalities around Ontario, is when they say you have to cut the tall grass, they don't identify the grass, because there are 1,200 different types of grasses, apparently, and which grass is the guilty one that has to be cut. And the City of Toronto, in their wisdom, after several iterations of rewriting their bylaw, to my understanding, they actually now have a definition of the grass, and it's called turf grass. In my particular case, you know, what I'm trying to argue is that you have to identify the grass and be very clear as to what you expect a property owner to do in order to not be in contravention of the bylaw. And when they use terms like grass, that is void for vagueness. It's too vague. It's unenforceable because it's so wide spectrum. It's not specific. And the irony is that if you look at the bylaws, the municipal bylaws, specifically in Ontario, what's called the municipal code, you have to be absolutely clear and define what it is that is in contravention. And this is one of my basic arguments with the city, that they have not been clear. And despite many attempts through emails, discussions, letters, to everyone from the mayor on down, the city has been totally unresponsive. And when you think about it, a city which is providing service to people, when the authorities that make decisions that affect your life are unresponsive, they're not fulfilling their quote-unquote duty to public service, as I understand it. And this is problematic, and that's certainly a major issue that I've been contending with since 2021. So this is the fourth year now that I've received notices of contravention and threats by the city to basically come in and cut everything. I was totally unaware that there's some kind of an issue with respect to tall grass and weeds. I just was letting things grow naturally because, quite frankly, I've done my share in terms of harming the environment. When I was growing up, I don't know, thousands of times that I cut the grass with my powered lawnmower or a push lawnmower initially. And I didn't realize until recently that there really is an environmental, ecological reason why you shouldn't be doing that just automatically and assuming that that's the norm. And in 2021, I was minding my own business, sitting in the front here, and a person came up, identified himself as a bylaw officer, and I said, yes, and he said, well, we've had a neighbor complaint. And I said, oh, what's that about? And he said, well, you have to cut everything that's over 20 centimeters long. And then I pointed out the Canada goldenrod, and I said, you mean the Canada goldenrod? And he said, everything. And I said, but why this plant? And he said, well, because people have allergies. So you can see the issue there is also that the bylaw officers are not trained. They are not trained to identify plants properly and to understand why they may be, for example, an allergen or not. Now, as I explained, a Canada goldenrod plant is not an allergen. And for the bylaw officer to state that this is an allergen, to me, was indicative of him not being informed. And therefore, what happened was in 2021, essentially, I ended up educating the bylaw officer and regarding, plants like the Canada goldenrod and milkweed. And he in turn informed me about how the bylaw works. And one of the things which was really key to me to explain how this all works is that it's only triggered when there is a neighbor complaint. And the way he put it was that, first of all, he said, I was very surprised to be called, to monitor this property because normally we do this like in industrial areas and so on, or places where buildings are abandoned, et cetera, and never in a residential area. And so he explained to me how this works. And to have a bylaw enforced based on a neighbor complaint, but not in other areas where there are no neighbor complaints, is inconsistent. It's arbitrary. And it is literally, because of that also, it's capricious. You never know whether a neighbor's going to complain or not. I mean, it's essentially what you end up with is you have neighbors, through their complaints, enforcing the bylaw. That's essentially what is happening. And it's ridiculous. I mean, if this is such a big problem, it must be enforced universally with no difference made between the one property owner or the other, depending on what neighbors he has, what their aesthetic sensibilities are, etc. So for me, that sort of inconsistency invalidates that whole bylaw enforcement process.
Yeah, a lot of
like
stuff.
switchgrass.
Yeah. You have the milkweed through there, the goldenrod. There's some other flowering perennials that are through here as well. Accidents do happen. If something does get cut by accident, it is it. But we'll do our best to make sure that any of the plant life perennials aren't damaged. The plants, the goldenrod, the milkweed, that's a perennial of sorts. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. So stuff like that isn't going to be touched, but the other grass is going to be cut down.
Now, as far as I know, there are other properties both in this community as well as in Mississauga generally that also have tall grass and weeds. Are you enforcing those as part of your bylaw?
If the city receives complaints about properties regarding nuisance weeds and tall grass, yes, we will inspect to verify if there is a violation. If there is a violation, we'll issue a notice to the
But if
owner
there
of
is
the property.
no complaint, then there is no action taken.
Generally not.
The bylaw officer was true to his word and actually appeared at my doorstep the following morning. I first took a few moments to remind them of my position regarding my denial of their entry into my property based on the fact that they did not produce a warrant issued by a justice of the peace. And that is a fundamental part of the Ontario Weed Control Act, which is that if a homeowner denies a bylaw officer and or a weed inspector and or enforcement personnel to enter their property, in other words, does not give them permission, then they have to obtain a warrant. And in this case, that particular re-emphasis, denial of permission, and the fact that they were in contravention of the Ontario Weed Control Act because they did not produce a warrant, that basically just went over their heads. They ignored it. And I once again attempted to elicit from the bylaw officer which grass exactly was to be cut. And he just basically said, tall grass, that's what's in the bylaw. And then they essentially proceeded to look for tufts, and usually in small areas, between and under trees, between and under the tall Canada goldenrod plants and the milkweed plants. They basically looked for the red fescue that was longer than 20 centimeters in the garden area. And the thought occurred to me, why would they go to this kind of trouble, expense, and so on and so forth to rid my garden plots of these small areas, which I roughly calculate might comprise maybe 10 or 20% of the area. It's not like the entire property is covered with red fescue that's over 20 centimeters in length. So this was a surprise to me that the city would go to that kind of extreme in order to the letter, as it were, enforce the bylaw in my particular case. After all the explanations, after all the information that was given to them with respect to bylaws, with respect to environmental concerns, with respect to concerns regarding biodiversity decline, etc. It just did not register whatsoever with the decision-making authorities in the city of Mississauga from the mayor on down. Well, the question is, why do the city officials insist on enforcing the bylaw on my property? Number one, the reason is because they received a neighbor complaint asking what exactly is the substance of the complaint. The answer that I've been given by the bylaw officer was that I was in violation of the 20 centimeter rule. So that's number one, because they received a neighbor complaint. And number two, the City of Mississauga has to be seen to be enforcing its bylaws. And that, to me, was an interesting sort of, I would say, interpretation of a need to essentially violate my charter rights in order that the City of Mississauga can be seen by the general public to be enforcing its bylaws. In other words, their political needs, quote unquote, regarding the management of the City of Mississauga is more important than your individual charter rights as a person, a citizen of Canada. So in addition to the red fescue that was being cut, they did also find a few of the guilty, quote-unquote, sow thistles that had already passed their prime in terms of flowering and were essentially collapsed over and had a few seeds left in their desiccated seed heads. But true to form, they spent time cutting those particular stems of the sow thistle because they are on the City of Mississauga's nuisance weed list. The other thing that they were very assiduous about making sure that they were following through to the nth degree, they found about 8 Canada thistles that were growing in the backyard. Now the Canada thistle, even though it appears on these lists, is actually a plant that is edible and that has medicinal properties. And during its flower stage, it provides a source of pollen for insects. And nevertheless, it is part of this listing of noxious or nuisance weeds, which again is primarily inspired by the Ontario Weed Control Act list. But one has to bear in mind that the Ontario Weed Control Act list is actually intended to protect agricultural and horticultural operations. It is not, in fact, except for a few examples such as poison ivy or poison oak or dog strangling vine, for example. So, except for relatively few examples like that, there is no particular urgent need to ensure that none of these plants exist in residential areas, because most residential areas are more than a kilometer away from the agricultural or horticultural operations and do not pose any threat or harm to the efficiency of those particular operations. So there's a room for some interpretation there, I think room for some discretion. If in this case my property is remote from those operations, why is this particular plant deemed guilty and needs to be removed? It doesn't really make sense to me. And the other thing that really is distressingly irrational about this whole process is that these same plants, including the Canada thistle, proliferate in all the natural areas in the City of Mississauga, natural parks, the ravines, the river banks, and so on and so forth. All of these areas have a multitude of these thistles, some of which are growing 5 to 6 feet tall, and they form like a wall. And yet they, on public property, are apparently not subject to the bylaw, but on private property, my private property, they are subject to the bylaw. And this seems to be a total self-contradiction, and it's something that really needs to be looked at, and some discretion needs to be applied, because there is no indication that I've been made aware of that any of my plants pose a present or imminent threat in terms of harm or safety considerations or fire hazard or this, that, or the other thing that the bylaw in terms of residential properties is supposed to protect. So I think this needs to be looked at in an adult, rational, and evidence-based way in order for these kind of situations to be avoided, where a property owner who has very valid, good intentions in terms of being a responsible citizen of the planet, in terms of the environment, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of global warming, all of these major considerations that face the world today and future generations. It needs to be evaluated in a more rational adult way so that citizens are accorded their constitutional rights to express themselves freely, to believe what they believe in, as long as it doesn't pose any present or imminent harm to anyone else. And this is certainly the case here on my property, and in my case with the City of Mississauga. One of the things that I've become or became from the get-go aware of was how distressing it is to, for example, happen to look out the window and see people, strangers, walking through your property and looking at things. And the immediate visceral reaction is that your heart rate and blood pressure goes up because you don't know who these people are, what are they doing. And it's literally a flagrant invasion of privacy. Privacy is a constitutionally protected right. You have the right to privacy unless there are extenuating circumstances, emergencies or whatever, or imminent danger. You have a right to enjoy your privacy. You have a right to enjoy the use of, the operation of, and the enjoyment of your property. And privacy is a key part of that. And certainly in terms of my personal experience, it's definitely a distressing moment to again be confronted with an invasion of your privacy, and there are definitely physiological and psychological harms, I would say, experienced.
Yeah, I don't think we need to factor it. Okay. Likewise, thank you for your work. Appreciate it.
All right, so you guys are heading back to the big field this afternoon? Yes, sir. Okie dokie.
All right, Mr. Ruck, we're finished today.
I see that. It's way past time to rescind Bylaw 125/2017. If you agree, please sign and share the petition at change.org to help fight Mississauga's Tall Grass and Weeds Bylaw. If you can, please donate at gofundme.com to help defray the legal costs. Thank you for supporting Change and Wildlife Habitat.